The alarm clock buzzed at 4 in the morning, same as it had for the past 11 years. Mei Lin reached over and silenced it before the second ring. She had trained herself to wake up this way, quick and quiet, because old habits from a different life never really leave you. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms in a building where the hallway always smelled like someone else's cooking. But it was hers. She had paid for every inch of it with her own hands, and that meant something. She moved through her morning routine without turning on the lights. Shower, simple clothes, hair pinned back tight so it would stay out of her face during the long day ahead. She caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror and paused for just a moment. 63 years old. When did that happen? Sometimes she still expected to see the young woman she used to be, the one with fire in her eyes and music in her fingertips. But that woman had disappeared a long time ago, somewhere between Shanghai and this small American city, somewhere between dreams and survival. The bus came at 4:45. Mei Lin was always the first one at the stop, standing alone under the flickering streetlight. The driver knew her by now, gave her a small nod as she climbed aboard. She sat in the same seat every morning, 3rd row on the right, and watched the dark streets roll by outside the window. At this hour, the city belonged to people like her, the cleaners, the cooks, the night shift workers heading home, the invisible ones who kept everything running while the rest of the world slept. The Hartwell Hotel rose up against the early morning sky like a palace from another century. It was one of those grand old buildings with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where wealthy people held weddings and charity events and business meetings that decided the fates of thousands. Mei Lin entered through the service door in the back, same as always. She punched her time card and collected her cleaning cart from the supply room. Mops, rags, bottles of chemicals, a vacuum cleaner that weighed almost as much as she did. These were her tools now. These were the instruments of her second life. She started on the 3rd floor, working her way through the conference rooms and private lounges. 11 years of doing this job had taught her things that no one ever talked about. She knew which guests left the biggest messes and which ones were surprisingly tidy. She knew that people threw away things they would later regret, that trash cans held secrets, that loneliness looked the same whether you found it in a penthouse suite or a studio apartment. She had learned to be invisible, to move through spaces without being noticed, to exist in the margins of other people's lives. But there was one room she always saved for last, the grand ballroom. It sat on the main floor, behind tall wooden doors that seemed to belong in a museum. The ballroom could hold 500 people when it was set up for an event, with enough space left over for a dance floor and a stage. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds, a masterpiece that most guests never even looked up to see. And in the corner, near the tall windows that faced the garden, there was a piano. Not just any piano. A Steinway concert grand, 9 feet long, with a finish so black and glossy that Mei Lin could see her reflection in it when she got close enough. She had priced one once, years ago when she first started working here. The cost was more than she would earn in a decade, maybe 2 decades. It was the kind of instrument that belonged in concert halls, in the hands of performers who had trained their whole lives for the stage. Every morning, Mei Lin cleaned around that piano with extra care. She dusted the legs, polished the bench, made sure no water spots marred its perfect surface. And every morning, she let herself stand beside it for just a few seconds longer than necessary, close enough to smell the wood and feel the weight of its presence. Close enough to remember. She had been 7 years old the first time she touched a piano. It happened in the music room of her school in Shanghai, a cramped space with peeling paint and a battered upright that was missing 3 keys. The teacher, a strict woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, had noticed something in the way young Mei Lin listened during lessons, the way her fingers moved unconsciously, tracing patterns in the air, the way her whole body seemed to lean toward the sound. That teacher changed everything. She convinced Mei Lin's parents, factory workers who had never dreamed of such things, to let their daughter study music. Lessons after school, practice on weekends, hours and hours spent in front of that old upright, learning scales and arpeggios and the language of composers who had died centuries before she was born. By the time she was 12, she had outgrown every teacher in her district. By 15, she was performing in concert halls. By 20, she was one of the rising stars of classical piano in China, a name that music critics wrote about with excitement and anticipation. Those years felt like a dream now, a beautiful dream that had belonged to someone else. She remembered the stages, the lights, the moment just before a performance when the audience fell silent and the whole world narrowed down to her hands and the keys beneath them. She remembered Chopin and Debussy, Liszt and Rachmaninoff, the way each composer spoke through her fingers in a different voice. She remembered the reviews, the applause, the feeling that she had been born for exactly this purpose. And she remembered Wei Jun. He had been a cellist, 3 years older than her, with a laugh that filled every room he entered. They met at a music festival in Beijing, fell in love over late-night rehearsals and shared meals and long conversations about art and life and everything in between. He was the first person who ever made her feel like she could have both things at once, the music and the life, the career and the love. They married when she was 26. 2 years later, they made the hardest decision of their lives. China was changing in those years. The political situation was complicated, dangerous in ways that were hard to explain to people who had never lived through it. Wei Jun had friends who had disappeared, colleagues who had been silenced. They had a baby daughter by then, a little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's laugh, and so they left. Not as famous musicians seeking new opportunities, but as refugees starting over with nothing. America was supposed to be a new beginning. But new beginnings, Mei Lin learned, are never as simple as they sound in stories. Her credentials meant nothing here. Her concerts, her reviews, her years of training and sacrifice, all of it vanished the moment she stepped off the plane. She spoke almost no English. She had no connections, no network, no one to open doors for her. And then, just 2 years after they arrived, Wei Jun got sick. Cancer. The word still felt like a knife in her chest even after all these years. She watched her husband fade over the course of 8 months, watched the man she loved become a shadow of himself. He died on a Tuesday morning in March with Mei Lin holding one hand and their 5-year-old daughter holding the other, and something inside Mei Lin died with him. After the funeral, she closed the lid of their small rented piano and never opened it again. There was no time for music now. There was only survival, a daughter to raise, bills to pay, a new language to learn, word by painful word. She took whatever work she could find, waitressing, factory assembly lines, cleaning houses for people who never looked her in the eye. Eventually, she found her way to the Hartwell Hotel, to the early morning shifts and the invisible life and the grand ballroom with its Steinway piano that she could clean but never play. 35 years. That was how long it had been since her fingers had touched the keys with intention. 35 years of walking past pianos in department stores and hotel lobbies, of changing the radio station when classical music came on, of building walls so high and so thick that she almost convinced herself the music had never existed at all. Almost, but not quite. Because every morning, when she stood beside that Steinway in the empty ballroom, something stirred in her chest, a feeling she had tried so hard to bury. And every morning, she walked away before she could give it a name. That was how Mei Lin Chen lived her life, invisible, silent, waiting for something she had stopped believing would ever come. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. It was the 3rd Saturday of October when everything started to shift. Mei Lin didn't know it yet, couldn't have guessed what that day would bring, but looking back later, she would remember every detail. The way the autumn light came through the ballroom windows, the smell of furniture polish and fresh flowers, the sound of her own footsteps on the marble floor, steady and familiar, like a heartbeat she had stopped noticing long ago. The hotel had been buzzing with activity all week. The annual Hartwell Foundation Gala was scheduled for that evening, the biggest event of the year. Mei Lin had worked enough of these galas to know what they meant. Wealthy donors in expensive clothes, champagne that cost more than her weekly paycheck, speeches about supporting the arts, about giving children opportunities, about making the world a better place. She never stayed for the events themselves. By the time the guests arrived, she was already on the bus heading home, her work done, her presents forgotten. But this year, something was different. She heard about it first from one of the kitchen staff, a young man who always seemed to know everything that happened in the hotel before anyone else did. The pianist had canceled. Not just any pianist, but the performer who had been booked for months, a well-known name who was supposed to provide the evening's entertainment. Food poisoning, apparently. He had called that morning, barely able to speak, apologizing over and over but making it clear that there was no way he could perform. Mei Lin listened to this news without expression. It wasn't her problem. She had floors to mop and windows to clean and a dozen other tasks that needed finishing before the setup crew arrived. But as she pushed her cart toward the ballroom, she felt something strange stirring in her chest. A flutter, a whisper, something she didn't want to name. The ballroom had already been transformed. Round tables covered in white linen filled the space, each one decorated with candles and centerpieces of autumn flowers. The chandeliers had been lowered and cleaned until they sparkled like captured stars. And there, on the small stage at the far end of the room, sat the Steinway. It looked different today. Someone had moved it to the center of the stage, positioning it so the performer would face the audience. The lid was propped open, revealing the golden strings inside, and a soft light had been aimed at the keys, so they seemed to glow. Mei Lin stood in the doorway and stared at it. She had cleaned that piano hundreds of times, but she had never seen it like this, ready, waiting, alive. She should have started working. There were still baseboards to wipe down, corners to vacuum, spots on the floor that needed attention. Instead, she found herself walking toward the stage. Slowly at first, then faster, as if something was pulling her forward against her will. Her cleaning cart sat abandoned by the door. Her practical mind shouted at her to turn around, to remember her place, to stop being foolish. But her feet kept moving. The stage was only 3 steps high, but climbing them felt like scaling a mountain. Mei Lin's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was crazy. She was a cleaning woman. She had no business being up here, no right to touch this instrument, no reason to risk her job over something as foolish as memory. And yet, she sat down on the bench. The leather was cool beneath her, smooth and perfectly maintained. She placed her hands in her lap and looked at the keys stretching out before her. 88 of them, black and white, arranged in the same pattern that had existed for centuries. She knew every single one. She knew the weight of them, the resistance, the way they would feel beneath her fingertips. She knew, even after 35 years of silence, exactly what each one would sound like. Behind her, she could hear voices in the hallway. The event coordinator was making phone calls, her voice tight with panic. Mei Lin caught fragments of the conversation. No available replacements, too short notice. The foundation director was going to be furious. Someone suggested recorded music, background tracks, anything to fill the silence. The coordinator said that wasn't good enough, that the Hartwell Gala was known for its live performances, that Mrs. Hartwell herself would never accept such a compromise. Mei Lin's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted them toward the keys. She wasn't going to play. She was just going to touch them, just once, just to remember what it felt like. That was all. One touch, and then she would climb down from this stage and go back to her cart and finish her work and never speak of this moment to anyone. Her index finger pressed down on middle C. The note rang out through the empty ballroom, pure and perfect and heartbreaking. It hung in the air like a question, like a prayer, like the first word of a language she had forced herself to forget. Mei Lin closed her eyes. The sound traveled through her finger, up her arm, into her chest where it wrapped around her heart and squeezed. 35 years. 35 years since she had heard herself make music. 35 years of silence, of grief, of telling herself that this part of her life was over. And now here was this single note, proving that it had never really gone away. It had just been waiting, patient, faithful, ready for her to come back. She pressed another key, then another. Her left hand joined her right, finding positions it had not held in decades. And then, without making any conscious decision, Mei Lin began to play. The piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the first serious works she had ever learned. She had performed it in her first real concert at 16 years old, her hands shaking so badly she thought she might faint. She had played it for Wei Jun on the night he proposed, in a practice room at the Beijing Conservatory, with moonlight streaming through the window and tears streaming down both their faces. She had played it at his funeral, the last time she ever touched a piano, her fingers moving automatically while her mind floated somewhere far away. Now the music came back to her like an old friend, not perfectly, not smoothly, not the way it would have sounded in her concert days. Her fingers stumbled over passages they once knew by heart. Her timing was off, her dynamics uneven. 35 years of rust showed in every phrase. But underneath the mistakes, something else was there, something real and raw and alive. The music was imperfect, but it was true. Mei Lin didn't notice when her eyes filled with tears. She didn't notice when they spilled over and ran down her cheeks, dropping onto her uniform, onto her hands, onto the keys themselves. She was somewhere else now, somewhere beyond this ballroom and this hotel and this life she had built out of necessity. She was in Shanghai, 16 years old, playing for the first time in front of an audience. She was in Beijing, falling in love with a cellist who made her laugh. She was in a cramped apartment in America, holding her husband's hand as he took his last breath. The music held all of it, every joy, every loss, every year of silence. It poured out of her fingers like water from a broken dam, unstoppable, overwhelming, necessary. She was so lost in the playing that she didn't hear the footsteps. She didn't notice the voices going quiet. She didn't see the small crowd gathering in the ballroom doorway, hotel staff and setup crew, and even a few early arriving guests who had wandered in from the lobby, drawn by the sound. The event coordinator stood frozen, her phone still pressed to her ear, her mouth slightly open. A waiter carrying a tray of glasses stopped so suddenly that two of them clinked together. A young woman from the catering team wiped tears from her eyes without knowing why. And in the back of the room, leaning on her cane and watching with sharp, knowing eyes, stood someone Mei Lin had never met but had heard about many times. A 91-year-old woman with silver hair and diamonds at her throat. The matriarch of the Hartwell family, the founder of the foundation, and once upon a time, a concert pianist herself. Mrs. Hartwell listened to the cleaning woman play Chopin, and she smiled. Mei Lin reached the final passage of the nocturne, the gentle cascade of notes that always reminded her of rain falling on water. Her fingers found their way home, settling into the last chord, letting it ring out into the silence. The final note faded, the spell broke, and Mei Lin opened her eyes. The applause hit her like a wave. She spun around on the bench, her heart stopping, her face going pale. People were clapping. People were crying. People were staring at her, this invisible cleaning woman in her plain uniform, with her cart still sitting by the door and her mop waiting to be used. Mei Lin stood up so fast she nearly knocked over the bench. Her mind raced with panic. She was going to be fired. She had overstepped, forgotten her place, done something unforgivable. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to beg for understanding. But before she could speak, the crowd parted, and a tiny old woman with a cane began walking toward the stage. The old woman moved slowly, her cane tapping against the marble floor with each step. The crowd stayed parted, watching in silence as she made her way toward the stage. Mei Lin stood frozen beside the piano bench, her hands clasped together, her whole body trembling. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear through the service door and never come back. But her legs wouldn't move. All she could do was watch this elegant stranger approach. Mrs. Hartwell was small, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself like someone who had never been small a day in her life. Her silver hair was swept up in a style that looked effortless, but probably took an hour to achieve. Her dress was simple, dark blue silk, but the diamonds around her neck caught the light with every step. She had to be at least 90, maybe older, but her eyes were sharp and bright, missing nothing. She reached the edge of the stage and stopped. For a long moment, she just looked at Mei Lin, studied her, took in the plain uniform, the sensible shoes, the tears still wet on her cheeks. Mei Lin felt like she was being read, like this woman could see straight through her skin to everything hidden underneath. When Mrs. Hartwell finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong. "Help me up these stairs, would you, dear?" Mei Lin blinked. Of all the things she had expected, a request for assistance was not one of them. But she moved automatically, years of service taking over. She stepped down from the stage and offered her arm. Mrs. Hartwell took it, her grip firm despite her age, and together they climbed the 3 small steps. Once on stage, Mrs. Hartwell released Mei Lin's arm and walked to the piano. She ran one hand along its gleaming surface, the way someone might touch the face of an old friend. Then she turned back to Mei Lin, who still stood near the edge of the stage, ready to flee at the first opportunity. "What is your name?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. "Mei Lin." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Mei Lin Chen. I cleaned the hotel. I am so sorry. I should not have touched the piano. I don't know what I was thinking. Please, I will go now. I will finish my work. It won't happen again." The words tumbled out in a rush, apologies piling on top of each other. Mei Lin's English was good after all these years, but when she was nervous, her accent grew stronger, her sentences more tangled. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her back. The event coordinator, the kitchen staff, the guests, all of them watching her humiliation. But Mrs. Hartwell held up one hand, and Mei Lin fell silent. "You play beautifully," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a polite compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Mei Lin shook her head. "No, I am out of practice. Many years, too many mistakes." "Mistakes?" Mrs. Hartwell made a small sound, almost like a laugh. "I heard Horowitz play once in New York, 1965. He made mistakes too, missed notes, fumbled passages. Do you know what I remember about that concert?" Mei Lin shook her head again. "I remember crying," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I remember feeling like he had reached inside my chest and touched something no one else had ever found. I remember walking out of that concert hall a different person than when I walked in." She paused, her sharp eyes fixed on Mei Lin's face. "That is what I felt just now listening to you, so please do not tell me about mistakes." Mei Lin didn't know what to say. She stood there, silent, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. This wasn't how the world worked. Cleaning women didn't play pianos at fancy galas. They didn't receive compliments from wealthy old ladies. They didn't matter. Mrs. Hartwell seemed to read her thoughts. She took a step closer, close enough that Mei Lin could smell her perfume. Something light and floral and probably very expensive. "I was a pianist once," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "A long time ago, before I married, before all of this." She gestured vaguely at the ballroom, the hotel, the empire her family had built. "I gave it up for a life I thought I wanted more. And I have had a good life. A wonderful life. But there are still nights when I dream about the music. When I wake up with my fingers moving against the sheets, playing pieces I haven't touched in 60 years. She reached out and took Mei Lin's hands in her own. Her skin was thin and papery, but her grip was warm. "Where did you study?" she asked. And so Mei Lin told her. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water finding its way through cracks in a dam. She told her about Shanghai, about the strict teacher with the gray hair who had seen something special in a factory worker's daughter. She told her about the conservatory, the competitions, the concerts. She told her about the reviews that called her a rising star, about the audiences who stood and cheered, about the feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. She told her about Wei Jun, about falling in love, about leaving everything behind to come to America with a husband and a baby and a suitcase full of dreams, about watching those dreams crumble one by one, about the cancer that took Wei Jun in 8 months, the poverty that followed, the job she worked to keep her daughter fed and clothed and safe, about closing the piano lid and promising herself she would never open it again. By the time she finished, both women had tears in their eyes. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Even the event coordinator, still clutching her phone, had stopped trying to solve the crisis and was simply listening. Mrs. Hartwell squeezed Mei Lin's hands tighter. 35 years, she said softly. 35 years without music. How did you survive? Mei Lin thought about the question. She had never really considered it before, not in those terms. Survival had just been something she did, day after day, year after year. Wake up, go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. She had built a life out of routine and responsibility and the stubborn refusal to feel too much. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think maybe I didn't. Not really. I think part of me has been asleep all this time." Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. Then she released Mei Lin's hands and turned to face the room. "We have a problem tonight," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "Our pianist is unable to perform. We have 300 guests arriving in 4 hours, expecting an evening of music and culture and everything the Hartwell Foundation stands for." She paused, letting the weight of the situation settle over the room. "But I believe I have found a solution." She turned back to Mei Lin. "Would you play for us tonight?" The question hung in the air. Mei Lin felt her heart stop, then start again at twice its normal speed. She looked at Mrs. Hartwell, certain she had misheard, but the old woman's eyes were steady, serious, waiting. "I cannot," Mei Lin said. I don't have the right clothes. I haven't practiced. I don't have sheet music. I am just the cleaning woman." "You are a pianist," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly. "Everything else is details. We have 4 hours. We can find you a dress. You can practice right here on this stage. And as for sheet music?" She smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to hold decades of wisdom. "I have a feeling you carry all the music you need right here." She touched her own chest, over her heart. Mei Lin looked out at the ballroom, the tables with their white linens, the chandeliers sparkling overhead, the faces watching her, some curious, some skeptical, some hopeful. She thought about her daughter, now a grown woman with children of her own, who had never heard her mother play. She thought about Wei Jun, who had always believed she would find her way back to the music somehow. She thought about 35 years of silence. And she thought about how tired she was of being invisible. Her voice shook when she spoke, but the words came out clear. "Yes," she said. "I will play." The smile that spread across Mrs. Hartwell's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. She clapped her hands together once, a sharp sound that echoed through the room and seemed to wake everyone from a trance. "Well then," she said, "we have work to do." The next 4 hours passed in a blur. Mei Lin barely had time to breathe, let alone think about what she had just agreed to do. The moment she said yes, Mrs. Hartwell took charge like a general commanding an army. Orders flew in every direction. Phone calls were made. People rushed in and out of the ballroom with purpose and urgency, and at the center of it all stood Mei Lin, feeling like she had stepped into someone else's dream. First came the dress. Mrs. Hartwell made a single phone call, and 20 minutes later, a woman arrived with a rolling rack of gowns. She introduced herself as a personal stylist, someone who worked with the hotel for special occasions. She looked Mei Lin up and down with professional eyes, circling her slowly, making small sounds of consideration. Mei Lin stood perfectly still, embarrassed and overwhelmed. She had not worn anything besides work uniforms and simple house clothes in years. The idea of putting on an evening gown felt absurd, like asking a sparrow to wear peacock feathers. But the stylist knew her work. She pulled dress after dress from the rack, holding each one up to Mei Lin's face, checking colors against her skin tone. Too bright, too young, too flashy. Finally, she stopped at a deep emerald green gown with a simple cut and elegant lines. No sequins, no elaborate beading, just beautiful fabric that seemed to flow like water. "This one," she said. "Try it on." The dress fit like it had been made for her. Mei Lin stood in front of the mirror in one of the hotel's private dressing rooms and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Her gray-streaked hair had been unpinned and styled into a soft updo. Light makeup had been applied to her face, nothing dramatic, just enough to bring out her eyes and warm her cheeks. And the dress transformed her completely, turning the invisible cleaning woman into someone who looked like she belonged on a stage. She pressed her hand against her stomach, trying to calm the butterflies inside. This was really happening. In a few hours, she would walk out in front of 300 wealthy strangers and play piano for the first time in 35 years. The thought made her want to run straight back to her cleaning cart and pretend none of this had ever happened. But there was no time for fear. Mrs. Hartwell appeared at the dressing room door, took one look at Mei Lin, and nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect," she said. "Now come. You need to practice." They returned to the ballroom, which was now buzzing with final preparations. Waiters set out silverware and folded napkins into elaborate shapes. Florists made last-minute adjustments to centerpieces. Sound technicians tested microphones and adjusted lighting, and through it all the Steinway waited on the stage, patient and gleaming, ready for Mei Lin to return. She climbed the steps and sat down at the bench. Her hands were shaking. She placed them on the keys and took a deep breath, trying to remember everything she had once known. Posture, hand position, the way to hold tension in her wrists without letting it spread to her fingers. It had been so long. What if she couldn't do it? What if the music that had poured out of her earlier had been a fluke, a one-time gift that would not come again? She started with scales, simple patterns, up and down the keyboard, the most basic exercises that every piano student learns in their first year. Her fingers felt stiff and clumsy at first. Notes came out uneven, sometimes too loud, sometimes too soft. But slowly, gradually, muscle memory began to wake up. Her hands started to remember what her mind had tried to forget. After the scales came arpeggios, then simple etudes, then, finally, real music. She played through Chopin's nocturnes, one after another, stumbling in places but pushing forward. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune, letting the dreamy melody wash over her like moonlight. She played a Liszt rhapsody that had once been one of her signature pieces, her fingers struggling to keep up with the demanding passages but finding their way through nonetheless. Mrs. Hartwell sat in a chair at the edge of the stage, listening without interruption. Occasionally, she would close her eyes and sway slightly, lost in the music. Other times, she would watch Mayleen's hands with the sharp attention of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing. She did not offer criticism or suggestions. She simply witnessed. The hours slipped away. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light faded into evening. Inside the ballroom, the transformation continued. Tables were lit with candles. The chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow. The stage lights were adjusted until they cast a warm spotlight on the piano and the woman seated before it. At 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Mei Lin watched from a side room as they streamed through the ballroom doors. Men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses, politicians and business leaders and society figures whose faces appeared regularly in magazines and newspapers. They greeted each other with air kisses and firm handshakes, moving through the room with the easy confidence of people who had never doubted their place in the world. The sight of them made Mei Lin's stomach clench with fear. These were not the audiences she had played for in Shanghai. Those had been music lovers, people who came to hear art for its own sake. These guests had paid thousands of dollars for their seats. They expected perfection. They expected a professional. Instead, they were going to get a 63-year-old cleaning woman who had not performed in over 3 decades. What had she been thinking? This was madness. She couldn't do this. She had to find Mrs. Hartwell and tell her there had been a mistake, that she needed to find someone else, anyone else. She turned to leave and nearly walked straight into the old woman herself. Mrs. Hartwell stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, her cane planted firmly on the floor. She looked at Mei Lin with knowing eyes. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. Mei Lin nodded, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Hartwell smiled gently. "Good. That means you understand what this moment requires. Only fools feel no fear before doing something that matters." She took Mei Lin's hand and held it between both of her own. "Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. The audience out there, they don't know what they want. They think they want technical perfection. They think they want a famous name on the program. But what they really want, what every human being wants, is to feel something, to be moved, to be reminded that they are alive." She squeezed Mei Lin's hand tighter. "You have something that cannot be taught and cannot be bought. You have a story. You have pain and love and loss and survival, all of it living inside your music. When you sit down at that piano tonight, you won't just be playing notes, you will be sharing your soul. And that, my dear, is worth more than any amount of technical perfection." Mei Lin felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back, not wanting to ruin the careful makeup the stylist had applied. "What if I fail?" she whispered. Mrs. Hartwell shook her head. "The only way to fail is to stay silent. Everything else is just music." From inside the ballroom, the sound of clinking glasses faded as someone tapped a microphone. The program was about to begin. Mrs. Hartwell released Mei Lin's hand and stepped aside from the doorway. "It's time," she said. Mei Lin took a deep breath. She thought about Wei Jun, who had always told her that her music was a gift meant to be shared. She thought about her daughter, who had never seen her play. She thought about all the years of silence, all the mornings spent cleaning around that beautiful piano, all the dreams she had buried so deep she thought they were dead. But they weren't dead. They had just been waiting. She stepped out of the side room and walked toward the stage. The crowd quieted as they noticed her approaching. 300 faces turned in her direction, curious, expectant, wondering who this unknown woman in the emerald dress might be. Mei Lin climbed the 3 steps to the stage. She walked to the Steinway and placed her hand on its smooth surface, just as she had done every morning for 11 years. But this time she did not step away. She sat down on the bench. She positioned her fingers over the keys. She looked out at the sea of faces watching her, and she allowed herself to smile. Then she began to play. The first note hung in the air like a question. Mei Lin let it fade before pressing the next key, then the next, building the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major one careful note at a time. The ballroom fell completely silent. 300 guests stopped their conversations, set down their champagne glasses, and turned their attention to the stage. Mei Lin kept her eyes on the keys. She couldn't look at the audience, not yet. If she saw their faces, their expectations, their judgment, she might lose her nerve completely. So she focused on the only thing that had ever truly made sense to her: the music. The nocturne was gentle, dreamy, the kind of piece that floated through the air like perfume. Mei Lin had chosen it deliberately for her opening, knowing it would ease both herself and the audience into what was to come. Her fingers found their way through the familiar passages, stumbling only slightly in the places where rust still clung to her technique, but the mistakes didn't matter as much as she had feared. The music carried them, absorbed them, turned them into something almost beautiful. By the time she reached the final notes of the nocturne, something had shifted in the room. The polite attention of the audience had transformed into something deeper. People were leaning forward in their seats. Some had closed their eyes. A woman in the front row was quietly dabbing at her cheeks with a napkin. Mei Lin allowed herself a single breath before moving into her next piece. Debussy's Clair de Lune. The melody rose from the piano like mist rising from water, soft and shimmering and impossibly delicate. This was the piece Wei Jun had loved most. He used to ask her to play it for him on quiet evenings in their tiny Shanghai apartment, back when they were young and the future seemed full of nothing but promise. She thought of him now, as she played, not with the sharp grief that had defined so many years, but with something softer. Gratitude, love, the bittersweet joy of having known someone who understood her completely. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. She let them fall onto her hands, onto the keys, becoming part of the music itself. The audience felt it. They couldn't have known what she was thinking, couldn't have understood the memories flowing through her fingers. But they felt the emotion. It passed from the piano into the air, wrapping around each person in the room, touching something private and tender inside them. By the end of Clair de Lune, half the audience was crying. Mei Lin didn't stop. She moved from piece to piece, building a program from memory alone. Liszt's Liebestraum, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a Rachmaninoff prelude that demanded every ounce of strength her 63-year-old hands could give. The music poured out of her like a river that had been dammed for decades, finally free to flow. And then, somewhere in the second hour, she did something she had not planned. She stopped playing Western classical music altogether. Instead, she began a simple Chinese folk melody, something her grandmother had hummed to her as a child. The tune was gentle and sad, a song about a young woman waiting for her love to return from a long journey. The shift caught the audience off guard. This was not what they had expected from a gala performance, but the surprise quickly gave way to wonder. The melody was beautiful in its simplicity, carrying the weight of centuries and cultures and stories they had never heard. Mei Lin played it once through, then began to improvise, weaving variations around the theme, adding harmonies that blended east and west in ways she had never attempted before. This was new. This was hers. Not a recreation of something she had performed in her youth, but something being born in this very moment, in this very room. Mei Lin felt herself smiling through her tears. For the first time in 35 years, she was not just remembering who she used to be. She was discovering who she had become. She played for 3 hours. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed lasted for several heartbeats. Then the ballroom exploded. The applause was like thunder. People rose from their seats, clapping and cheering and wiping their eyes. The standing ovation spread through the room like a wave until every single guest was on their feet. Mei Lin sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed, unable to process what was happening. She had imagined polite applause, maybe some curious questions about who she was. She had not imagined this. Mrs. Hartwell was the first to reach the stage. The old woman climbed the steps with surprising speed, her cane forgotten somewhere behind her. She took Mei Lin's hands and pulled her to her feet, then wrapped her in a hug that was stronger than her small frame suggested. "Thank you," Mrs. Hartwell whispered in her ear. "Thank you for reminding me why I started this foundation in the first place." The rest of the evening passed in a dream. Guests approached Mei Lin one after another, shaking her hand, praising her performance, asking about her background. She answered their questions as best she could, still dazed, still not quite believing any of this was real. Business cards were pressed into her palm. Invitations were extended. A music critic for the city's largest newspaper asked if she would be willing to do an interview. But the moment that mattered most came near the end of the night, when Mei Lin finally checked her phone. There were 17 missed calls from her daughter, who lived across the country with her husband and 2 children. There were also several text messages, each one more excited than the last. Someone at the gala had posted a video of Mei Lin's performance online. It had already been shared thousands of times. Mei Lin stepped outside to call her daughter back. The night air was cold, but she barely felt it. Her hands were shaking as she pressed the button. Her daughter answered on the first ring. "Mom!" The word came out half laughing, half crying. "Mom, I just watched the video. I had no idea. All these years, I had no idea you could play like that. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Mei Lin closed her eyes. How could she explain 35 years of silence? How could she make her daughter understand the grief that had closed her heart, the survival that had demanded all her attention, the fear that had kept her away from the only thing she had ever truly loved? "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have told you. I should have played for you. I was just so scared." Scared of what? Mei Lin thought about the question. She thought about Wei Jun, about Shanghai, about all the years of cleaning hotel rooms and riding early morning buses and being invisible. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell's words, about how the only failure was staying silent. "Scared of feeling," she finally answered. "Scared that if I let the music back in, all the pain would come with it. But I think I was wrong. I think the music was never the problem. It was the solution. I just couldn't see it until tonight." Her daughter was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I'm flying out next weekend," she said. "I'm bringing the kids. I want them to meet their grandmother, the real one, the pianist." Mei Lin smiled, tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time that night. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." She returned to the ballroom for the final moments of the gala. Mrs. Hartwell found her and made an announcement to the remaining guests. The Hartwell Foundation would be offering Mei Lin a position as the hotel's resident pianist. There would also be a scholarship established in her name to support young musicians who faced obstacles in pursuing their dreams. Mei Lin listened to these words and felt something shift inside her chest. A door that had been closed for 35 years, finally swinging open. A part of herself she thought she had lost forever, returning home at last. She continued playing at the Hartwell Hotel every weekend for the next 7 years. She taught master classes. She mentored young pianists. She reconnected with her daughter and became the grandmother she had always wanted to be. And on quiet mornings, when the ballroom was empty and the chandeliers cast soft light across the floor, she would sit at the Steinway and play just for herself, just for Wei Jun, just for the girl she used to be, who had fallen in love with music in a cramped practice room in Shanghai all those years ago. When May Lynn passed away peacefully at the age of 70, the Steinway in the Hartwell Ballroom was retired from regular use. A small plaque was placed on its lid, inscribed with words that Mrs. Hartwell had chosen herself before her own passing 3 years earlier. The plaque read simply, "For May Lynn, who taught us that music waits for us, no matter how long we are gone." And sometimes, late at night when the hotel is quiet and the ballroom is dark, staff members swear they can still hear the faint sound of a piano playing, a gentle nocturne, a Chinese folk song, the music of a woman who found her way home.